else has this problem? You sit down at your local game store or just with your friends to play a brand new commander, and then you quickly realize after 1 or 2 games that, yeah, this commander was actually a bit too powerful for my group. So either you scrap the deck or you go ahead and you just, dial down the power level. But over time, your barometer for this type of thing gets much better. You start to realize that, yeah, that commander is probably going to be too powerful for my group, unless I make it budget or unless I purposefully dial it down for my selected group that I'm going to be playing in. Now, my barometer has been adjusted time and time again, and probably for the remainder of my commander playing career, it's going to be the same. But it really was difficult for me to come up with a deck that I felt happy about playing, that was powerful enough to be used in a casual group, but not so powerful that it was going to break the game. And I decided that I was going to make somewhat of a challenge out of it. I was going to see, can I build an Isshin 2 Heavens as 1 deck for under $50 US and have it powerful enough to compete with my group and also groups out in the wild? And here's how I did. So if you are a member over my Patreon, you've already seen me post about Isshin, and this deck went through just a couple different iterations, but I pretty much got it right almost right off the bat. And what inspired me to go back and build this commander was this gnawing idea in the back of my head that I've been thinking about building it for so long, but I've just been suppressing it because I know that Isshin is a strong commander. I've played against other Isshin decks that have done degenerate things, tons of extra combat steps, really powerful effects. They use things that cheat cards out onto the board. Some people run Eldrazi with like a sneak attack on the board, Annihilator you double. It's crazy. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to have a good play experience with a budget deck. And again, I wanted to do it for under $50. So I think I finally landed on the correct iteration for me. And after a few key recent reprints, say that 10 times fast, we are at a very happy place with our commander deck. So my total cash investment for this deck was around $45, maybe $50. I forget the exact TCG order, but it was relatively cheap. I didn't actually have to invest a ton of money into this deck, and the results kind of speak for themselves. It does pretty much crazy things every single time that I play the deck. One of my friends has been on record with basically stating that I need to treat this deck with extra scrutiny because even though it's a budget deck and even though it doesn't seem like it's going to do a lot, it just goes crazy every time. And that basically sums up my play experience with this commander. Unless I get removed right away multiple times with Isshin, as long as I play things properly, and the key here is to use Isshin as a payoff, not running him out early, typically I have a very good time running this commander. So let's sort of go through my thought process with building this deck. I had a few different sections of my brain when I was building this deck. First off were the new cards that I wanted to include in the deck, and we'll talk about those. I have them right here. And then we also had this idea of maybe a dungeon sub-theme, so like a venture into the dungeon, initiative build. I've been watching a lot of Canadian Highlander recently, and initiative is still extremely strong. I know they're sort of gradually moving away from it, but the ability to bring the initiative into an Isshin deck with the double attack trigger, double the venture, that type of thing is really strong. And on top of that, there are just some generically powerful cards that I also wanted to include in this deck, which we'll also talk about. And a lot of these, honestly, are new releases just over the last 1 to 2 years. And then there's been some key reprints just very, very recently, in fact, just over the past few months that made this deck even more economical to build. So maybe let's start with that. Let's talk about the reprints. One of them is Deflecting Palm. And another one is Anguished Unmaking. There you go. This was printed in the Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It's down to something insane like 50 cents now. I mean, the alt art is not my favorite, admittedly, but if you're building on a budget and you want to actually own the cards, there you go. Now's your time. Same thing with Deflecting Palm. It just recently got reprinted. I think I was able to pre-order some copies for 20 cents or something, like crazy. This card used to be $4 or something, and I didn't include it in any of my decks because I felt like it was a bit overcosted for what it did. But now I get to use it for 20 cents, and it feels really good. Being able to deflect big damage at me time and time again is great. And then we have some new releases. So one of the cards that I was most excited for in Outlaws of Thunder Junction was this one. It's Great Train Heist. I don't know if I've talked about it on the channel before, but it's a 1 mana instant spree card, with spree meaning you can cast any number of these as long as you pay the additional cost. By the way, this is just a note. You cannot just cast this for red. You must cast this with something spreed. Otherwise, you will not be able to cast the card. That's just an FYI for everybody. But the short of this is essentially for 4 mana, you get to untap all creatures and get another combat phase. Or for 3 mana, well, it's actually an additional 2. Creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain first strike until end of turn. And the third option is 1 red. Choose target opponent. Whenever a creature you control deals damage to that player this turn, create a tapped treasure token. There are no attack triggers on this, but why did I include it? The issue with Isshin is that you need a way to end the game. And a lot of the way that people end the game already are either the high end, things like Eldrazi that they cheat out, or just sort of looping infinite extra combat steps, or perhaps catching people on some type of, Teferi's Protection, I untap with all my stuff, and then I swing out and kill you type of situation. Now, Teferi's Protection is literally the cost of this entire deck. All of the extra combat spells, or at least a majority of them, are just far too expensive for me to include in this deck. But Grain Train Heist kind of does it all for us. It gives us the ability to take an extra combat if we need it. It gives us the ability at an earlier stage in the game, if I have a bunch of tokens, to swing out and make a bunch of tapped treasure, which fuels my bigger cards, which we'll go over. Or it does the first strike as sort of like a combat trick to kill people's, blocking creatures and also sort of net me some advantage. It's great. Every time I have this card, I'm very satisfied with it. I think there's been one experience where it's been trapped in my hand at an earlier stage as I've sort of drained myself. I've already played out a lot of my cards, but that's 1 out of 15 or 20 games that I've had with this deck. Every other time I've used it, I've been very satisfied with it, and it's still very inexpensive. I thought for some reason, I bought 7 or 8 copies of this because I thought it was going to be a $10 card because of the crazy flexibility that it gives you. But alas, that has not happened. It's still $1.50 or $2, but for you, that means that you get a crazy good effect for very cheap. So pick up this card now if you're looking to buy in it. Right before the Outlaws of Thunder Junction set, we had Murders at Karlov Manor, and that released Aurelia, the Law Above. Whoop, there you go. 5 mana. It's a legendary angel 4/4 with great keywords: flying, vigilance, and haste. And vigilance in an attacking deck is insane. We have specifically cards in here like Brave the Sands, which I kept out for a reason, that allow you to give your creatures vigilance. Aurelia just has vigilance on it naturally, which is amazing, but it gets better. Whenever a player, not just you, attacks with 3 or more creatures, I get to draw a card. And if Isshin is out, that means we draw 2 cards. Also, it gets better. Whenever a player attacks with 5 or more creatures, Aurelia the Law Above deals 3 damage to each of your opponents, and then you gain 3 life. In best case scenario, you have your commander out while this is on the battlefield and it triggers, banging everybody for 6, and then you gain 6 in addition to whatever your combat's going to be. This card is great. A majority of the time, I'm able to play a 2-mana rock like a Talisman. Maybe I can run Isshin out, and then the very next turn I can play Aurelia. And then very shortly thereafter, either I have tokens out or I can play this on an empty board with tokens. And then I can go ahead and start cashing in on the value of having this card out on the battlefield. It also, in many circumstances, acts as sort of a semi-stacks piece because people don't want to attack with additional creatures if they don't have to, i.e. maybe the token player, when they have 6 or 7 tokens out on the board, maybe they don't want to swing out fully because they don't want to trigger your ability on Aurelia. It's one of those cards that I think sort of flies under the radar. And again, I thought it was a card that was going to be very expensive because it has really great effects on there. But I think it's one of those cards where it's very fair at 5 mana, but it would be absolutely busted disgusting at 4 mana. But for you, again, that means you get a really cheap card with a really great effect. So now's the time to grab this one too. Now, the last card is one that absolutely shattered my mind with how good it's been, and that's Caesar, Legion's Emperor. So this is a Fallout card, very new, and whenever you attack, so doubled, you can sacrifice another creature. When you do, choose 2. So you get to create 2 1/1 red and white soldier tokens with haste that are tapped and attacking, draw a card, lose a life, or this card deals damage equal to the number of creature tokens you control to target opponent. Now, when I first started playing this card, I actually was only triggering it 1 time, I was triggering it twice with Isshin, but I was only choosing one of the modes. You choose 2 of the modes for sacrificing 1 creature. Not only do we have a ton of ways to make tokens in this deck, but in addition to that, the doubling up of this effect here is just crazy. Whoop. Being able to sack a creature on attack twice and get 2 of these modes fuels itself, because on the first attack, you can choose to sacrifice either an existing token or something else that you have on the board. You make 2 of the red and white soldiers, and then you probably draw a card most likely. And then on the next sort of instance of this happening, you can sacrifice one of those tokens that you just made, because that trigger happens and resolves next. Then you get to make more tokens if you so choose and draw more cards, or have this guy start beaming people. It's so good. This card is great. It's impressed me every time, and it's super cheap. You don't have to pay a lot of money for this. I think it's like $1 or something, unless it's gone up. Give this card a look if you're building a budget Isshin deck for sure. Now, we've already sort of went over it, but Brave the Sands, I have to just preach about this card for a second. I've been called preachy before, but you're about to get a full dose of it right now. This card is insane. It's like $2, mind you, so it's a little bit outside of some people's budgets, but Brave the Sands being a 2-mana enchantment to give everything vigilance, and you can also block additional creatures, is just crazy. Every time I use this card, I'm always satisfied. A lot of the time, people don't want to remove this on the board because typically you're playing in a pod, most likely, where people are going to have other problem enchantments that they want to remove. For instance, if somebody has a Rhystic Study out on the board and you have this out, highly unlikely that Brave the Sands gets removed, much more likely Rhystic Study gets the axe. So in most pods that I've played in, Brave the Sands basically never gets removed. It gives everything vigilance forever. It makes your attacking so much easier because you don't have to think about, keeping things back to hold them up for blocks. And on top of that, your blocks are improved because you can block additional creatures per combat. And in a token-heavy deck, that goes a very long way. This card is great, and you must include it if you're going to play Isshin for sure. Please include this card. Let's just take a little side quest, a little side adventure, if you will, into the world of the dungeon and the initiative. So I have a very small initiative/venture into the dungeon package in this deck, and that includes cards like, I'll just read it out now, Triumphant Adventurer, Caves of Chaos Adventurer, White Plume Adventurer, and Thorough Investigation. Now, cards like Thorough Investigation somewhat make the most sense in this deck just because you get to just generate clues, doubling that every time, allowing you to draw additional cards as the game goes on by sacrificing those clue tokens. It generally makes a lot of sense without even having a dungeon-focused deck. But there's other cards like the ones I just mentioned that really go pretty hard in this deck. So for instance, now Triumphant Adventurer is a 2-mana 1/1 Death Toucher, and as long as it's your turn, it has first strike, which is great. But the better part is the attack trigger, which allows you to venture. And venturing twice due to Isshin's ability is really just crazy. You can make this more group slug by going into something like the Tomb of Annihilation, or just take a more conservative and sort of logical approach in the Lost Mine of Phandelver. And if you have the initiative, it's even better. As long as you're able to progress in the Undercity, you're doing absolutely degenerate, crazy things with this card. And it's all for 2 mana, and it's a good blocker, and it disincentivizes people from blocking it because it's going to deal the damage, and you don't even have to deal the damage to get the trigger. Do I need to make any more of a case to have this card? It's really good. I've been very impressed by it every single time that I've played it. I play this in regular dungeon decks, but in this particular situation, it goes really hard, and I can't recommend it enough. Next, let's talk about the most obvious next option, which is Caves of Chaos Adventure. So this is a 5/3 for 4 mana with Trample, and when it ETBs, you take the initiative. Now, we're not here about the ETB trigger, although it's good. We are here for the next part where it says whenever it attacks, so double this trigger, exile the top card of your library. If you've completed a dungeon, you may play that card this turn without paying its mana cost. Otherwise, you can just play the card this turn. This card's great for a number of reasons. If you run this out on 4 mana, make sure you do it before you play your land. If you attack with this, make sure you do it before you play a land, because you might just hit a land off the top because we're running a budget deck here, and you want to ensure that you have the flexibility to just play the land that you just hit. The upside to this is that you get to run through either the Undercity or Lost Mines of Phandelver or something like that. You get to cast a card for free. I have hit things like Drakuseth, Maw of Flames, Elderbrain, and other big hitting cards off the top. It's insane. This card is really good, and it's a great sort of middling piece to throw in there because the stat line is pretty aggressively costed. So it's a 4 mana 5/3 and with trample, and you get the attack trigger. It's really good. And the last card that I want to talk about is White Plume Adventurer. Now, this card basically broke an entire format. It's banned now, I think, in Vintage, I want to say. It's disgusting. So 3 mana, 3/3. When it enters the battlefield, you get the initiative. We don't really care too much about that. We do, but we don't. And at the beginning of each opponent's upkeep, by the way, untap a creature you control. So you're giving something pseudo vigilance multiple times if you have attacked with multiple things. And on top of that, if you've completed a dungeon, untap everything instead. You can see why I included this card. So not only can you play this to get the initiative back in the event that you already have it, maybe you've cast the Caves of Chaos Adventurer, somebody hit you and took it away, you get to take the initiative back by playing White Plume Adventurer. But on top of that, you also get to give something pseudo-vigilance if you haven't completed a dungeon, which will hopefully protect the initiative. And on top of that, if you've completed a dungeon, you just get to untap everything when this card's out on the battlefield. We already talked about how good Brave the Sands is. This card is just crazy, and it's on a body. So that's my little dungeon package. I've been very impressed by it. I've actually been able to complete multiple dungeons every single game when I am able to stick one of these cards for at least 1 or 2 turns, just because, you're venturing pretty much at every upkeep if you have the initiative. And on top of that, being able to get double the attack trigger, double the clue sacrificing, etc., goes a really long way for you completing the dungeons. And I think it was a really great addition for specifically a budget deck. Now, we can sit here all day and talk about extra combat spells. That's not really my thing. I wanted to include extra combat spells that were a bit more unique, a bit niche. I didn't even see this card show up on the Isshin page, and that is Response Resurgence. So Response is 2 Hybrid Boros for an instant that deals 5 damage to target attacking or blocking creature, which comes up more than you might think. And then the 5 mana portion, which is a sorcery, that's the one that we really care about here. That one is creatures you control gain first strike and vigilance until end of turn. Already pretty good. After this main phase, there's an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase. I don't think I even need to explain why that's so good. This card wins games. Giving everything first strike and vigilance and an extra combat is just insane. Yeah, Isshin's out on the board. Let's double every attack trigger. Let's go ahead and make sure that my creatures are basically protected and I'm not going to have to tap them, which means I can attack freely. Yeah, seems really good. This card has won me games by itself because I'm able to get through for the additional damage that I need, or I get so much value off of other cards that you're going to see that it's basically impossible for my opponents to get over. Really great card. The next one is Hexplate Wallbreaker. So this actually came in one of the Phyrexia All-Be-One Commander decks, I believe. It's 5 mana for an equipment. It does have 4 Mirrodin, meaning you get to just equip this as it comes in onto a 2/2 Rebel. The equipped creature gets +2/+2, so that's a 4/4 Rebel. Whenever the creature attacks, if it's the first combat phase of the turn, untap each attacking creature. After this phase, there's an additional combat phase, and the equip cost is 4. So right away, it's good because you just get a body, and it's a 4/4, which is okay. But then on top of that, if you do have Isshin out, you're going to get an additional combat phase doubled. I just had to take a moment just to confirm something. So it does work the way that I think it works. So I've only been able to use this a couple of times. Each time it's been great, but normally it's in conjunction with something that gives my stuff vigilance, like a Brave the Sands effect, for instance. Now here's the thing. It gets the first untap on the very first attack, but it's going to try to untap your things twice. You will get another combat, like 2 combats, but the problem here is that once you go to your first extra combat, everything will be untapped. You can attack with everything, but you don't get another untap. So you need something to grant vigilance in order for this card to work effectively. And it's probably why a lot of people maybe don't run this one as opposed to a lot of the other much more easy, low-hanging fruit extra combats you see in Isshin lists, but it's still really good and I think it's worth a look. Just a few more support cards that I want to really point out just being exceptionally good, especially on a budget. One is Duelist Heritage. This is a 3 mana enchantment. Whenever one or more creatures attack, by the way, that's not just yours, it's opponents. You can go ahead and be a little bit, what's the right word for this? You can be a little bit political with it. You may have target attacking creature gain double strike. Now, obviously, the attacking clause here doubles it. So you get 2 things with double strike. Turns out having multiple like 7/7s or whatever with double strike and doubling their attack triggers, etc., goes a really long way. It protects your board. You can use it as a political piece. I've had people go ahead and kill problem opponents because they have enough creatures out that I can go ahead and give certain key cards double strike to kill my opponents or kill problem planeswalkers, etc. This card's really good. It's really scary. I think this is one of the more scary cards that people see on the battlefield and they go, oh no, we can't have that out. But trust me, this card is another one that I absolutely would encourage you to absolutely include. And it recently got reprinted too, making it even cheaper for you to pick up. And the next one is actually interesting. I've always wondered why people play or don't play this card, but play cards like Fervor, which is an enchantment, right? This is basically Fervor on a creature. It's 3 mana for a defender and reach card. And it's a wall. Creatures you control have haste. It's Tuk Tuk Rubble Fort. And I've been so impressed with this card. Having this out at an early stage in the game deters attacking against you. A lot of times people get really scared of this card, so they, swords it away or whatever, meaning I'm more apt to run out my commander at an earlier stage. I've been really impressed by it. I understand people want the enchantment like Fervor to stick on the board. Maybe that's why they run it. But if you're looking at a budget, I got a card like this for 5 cents. You can pick up the haste enabling card like this for 5 cents. It goes a long way. It deflects hate. It's been a stud in pretty much every circumstance I've used it in. So I would go ahead and give Tuk Tuk Rubble Fort a look if you're looking for a very cheap haste enabler in your Isshin deck. And now we're in the home stretch. So I just have a couple more that I want to talk about. First is Anim Pakal Thousandth Moon. This was another recent card that came out. I didn't mention it because this one is more of a payoff than anything else, which is what we're in now. Whenever you attack with one or more non-gnomes, which I think is everything in this deck except for the gnome token that gets made here, put a 1/1 counter on Anim Pakal, then create X 1/1 colorless gnome artifact creature tokens that are tapped and attacking, where X is the number of 1/1 counters on Anim Pakal. Now listen, you don't need any 1/1 counter support in this deck to understand how crazy this gets, how fast. Let's just run out an example on the board. Let's say that Anim Pakal isn't even attacking because it just says whenever you attack. So you attack with something, but have Anim Pakal out on the board. Easy. Let's also assume that Isshin is on the board. You get to put a 1/1 counter on Anim Pakal, then create X 1/1 gnome tokens. This happens twice. The first instance of it the second trigger will resolve first, meaning you get to put a 1/1 counter on Anim Pakal, meaning you make 1/1 gnome tapped and attacking somebody. But then the second trigger resolves. You put another 1/1 counter on Anim Pakal, and then you go ahead and make 2 1/1 gnomes attacking somebody. You can see where this is going. There have been situations where she has had existing on her, I think like 4 or 6 counters. If you have 4 counters on Anim Pakal, that means you get 11 gnomes attacking if it's doubled. If you have 6 counters on Anim Pakal, that means you get 13 gnomes tapped and attacking somebody of your choice. It doesn't even have to be the player that you're attacking. It's insane. Anim Pakal is a win condition. It's an army in a can. It's self-enabling, so even if Isshin gets removed, you can still attack with Anim Pakal in order to trigger the ability. Plus, Anim Pakal gets big in the process. It's just incredible. Anim Pakal has been a crazy card in this deck. Absolutely must include this if you're building it, even on a budget, even though she's like a couple bucks now. Just busted for the effect that you get. Sort of a bonus include here, I would say, is Othari. I'll just throw it up on screen. I don't have it pulled out of my deck right now. Othari is another really good one. It's similar to the Anim Pakal effect. I would definitely recommend including Othari in every single Isshin deck. It's like 20 cents. Pick it up. Throw it in your Isshin deck. It's great. And then the last 2 heavy hitters. First is Drakuseth. You saw me mention it earlier. Drakuseth is a 7 mana, 7/7 dragon with flying. Flying it matters much more than you might think. And whenever it attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target and then 3 damage to each of up to 2 targets. So existing already on this card is let me attack and I'm going to deal 10 damage to anything that I want, which is really good. But it gets even better when it's doubled with Isshin and you get 20 damage divided as you want on the board. How about I remove all of the problem creatures? How about I remove a problem player from the game? I'll attack and I'll deal 27 damage as long as this gets through. It's crazy. Drakuseth has won me games pretty much by itself. It keeps the board clean. It's an upper end threat to the top of your curve that is reliable even by itself, which is something that I think matters in this deck. You want cards that matter by themselves. It's been great. And speaking of another card that's great by itself, I'm sad that I don't have the good art for it in this deck. That is Elderbrain. You guys know how much I love Elderbrain, but let me just preach about it for a second. It's a 7-mana 6/6 with Menace, by the way. And whenever it attacks a player, by the way, that's why it's in here, exile all cards from that player's hand, and then they draw that many. You may play lands and cast spells from among them this way. Spend mana as though it were mana of any color, etc. Elderbrain has basically been a 7-mana 6/6 that draws me an extra 14 cards. Why is that? Well, on the sort of low end, you hit somebody with like not a lot of cards in their hand, but on average, you're going to hit somebody with like 5 to 7 cards in hand, at least in my experience, in my pods that I play in. So when it gets doubled with Isshin, they exile all the cards in their hand, then draw that many, and then you can play all those cards, but then they do it again. So the trigger goes on the stack twice, and they exile all the cards they just drew, and then you get to just have them draw more cards again, but you get all of those cards for the remainder of the game, and you can cast them and play lands at any time. Typically, when something like this resolves, I'm able to hit some absolute gas out of that person's deck. A lot of time I get removal or card draw or whatever, and you could spend mana as though it were mana of any type, meaning that even if it's an off-color deck, it doesn't matter, because if you want to cast a Rhystic Study for for the required amount of mana for Rhystic Study 3 mana, then you get to do it in Isshin, even though you're not in blue, because you have Elderbrain. And there's a lot of other great examples. You have access to counter spells if you hit the blue player, the draw spells like I already mentioned, and you get to play lands out of this pile, which is just insane. You never miss a land drop again for the rest of the game. Elderbrain is already good, but it's absolutely cracked in Isshin. I'd highly recommend that you give it a try. And guys, that's it, for fear of my camera battery dying, because I've been talking for so long about this commander. That is sort of the rough layout for my deck. There's some good new cards in here. There's some very, very budget extra combat spells that I feel like are much more fair, and or they just break the back of your opponents, allowing you to win, which is also a desirable effect, because the worst case scenario is you take extra combats that you can't actually close the game out with. And I think in this particular version of the deck, I feel like I did a pretty good job of sort of balancing those two things. We have some dungeon package stuff going on. We have great vigilance cards. We have great combat tricks like the deflecting palm. We have top end finishers, which I hope you top deck, that basically close the game out for good. We have the haste enabling, the double striking. We have a lot of stuff in here. I didn't even go over some of the other mechanics like the goat effects in this deck, which are great. It's a really fun deck. And again, I bought it for like $45. You can probably pick it up for 50 to 60 on the low end, depending on where you buy it from. I typically shop on TCG Player. And if you're looking for a very powerful deck, but I would also argue a very fair deck that's not going to totally break the game like I've seen other Isshin lists do, I'd recommend that you give this list a try. I've had a ton of fun with it. I'm actually probably going to keep it together because I think I'm going to slowly modify this deck as I go. I already have one deck that I give to new players when they enter into my group. That's just a +1/+1 counter deck. But I think this deck is fun enough, aside from maybe the dungeon stuff, which can be slightly confusing. But the remainder of it is pretty straightforward. You just want to play big things and attack with big things and feel strong about doing it. And that's exactly what this deck accomplishes. I think that this deck would be great for a new player. I think that this deck would be fun for a more experienced player who's looking for a bit more of a challenge. You can maybe change out a few cards and sort of make it your own, add your own stamp to it. And you could still have a good time in doing so. And that's the point. That's the point of building decks in this type of capacity, which is to enjoy Commander more often. Because I find that, unfortunately, if you don't have appropriate power decks or appropriate sort of structured decks, a lot of times the power imbalance that gets created sort of takes away from the fun of the game. And I'm hoping that by putting out more videos like this, I can sort of spread the love for more of the budget, but power budget sort of deck lists, and hopefully open more people's eyes to the fact that you don't have to be running all of the crazy staple includes in every single Commander deck that you build. You can build a really strong deck for $50 And this is, I think, a prime example of that. But thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you enjoyed it. Go ahead and do all the YouTube things, the commenting and subscribing, etc. We are on our way to about 5,000 subs at the time of making this. I think we're at about 3,500, which is crazy to me. It's just insane. So thank you very much for that. But you know, the more the merrier, the more people that we can bring in to have more better games of Commander, the better. So please do all of the YouTube things. I will see you guys very soon for another video. I've been Kyle, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.